Trump's new national security strategy makes one thing very clear. In Washington's hierarchy of threats and interests, Asia, especially the broader Indo-Pacific and the Taiwan question, is now the main theatre. Instead of being one regional file among many, Asia is where this White House believes America's global position will be decided. The strategy is built around competition with China, the defense of Taiwan, control of sea lanes from Japan down to the Malacca Strait, and the role of key partners like India, Japan and Australia in sharing the burden. For years, US administrations talked about a pivot or rebalance to Asia, but were constantly pulled back into the Middle East or Europe. Trump's new national security strategy basically says this is no longer optional. The Indo-Pacific is where the future of US power is contested. The document is framed around preventing a major war with China, but doing so from a position of overwhelming strength. As the strategy puts it, the national security strategy states, deterring a conflict over Taiwan, ideally by preserving military overmatch, is a priority. That one line tells you almost everything about Washington's mindset in Asia. The central fear is a China-US clash over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. The way to avoid that clash, in Trump's view, is not accommodation but visible military superiority. Taiwan is no longer treated as a quietly managed issue. It is pushed to the front of the strategy. This is reinforced by the context. The strategy was released just as Beijing carried out one of its largest maritime shows of force in East Asian waters, sending ships around Taiwan and Japan. So when Washington talks about Asia now, it's talking about a concrete near-term risk of conflict and about organizing the entire regional posture around deterring that war. The strategy doesn't treat Asia only as a military chessboard. It frames the Indo-Pacific as the key economic and political arena of the century. According to the document, the region now generates almost half of global GDP on a purchasing power basis and is expected to dominate the 21st century. It warns that the Indo-Pacific will remain among the next century's key economic and geopolitical battlegrounds. This builds on a longer trend. Even the 2017 Trump-era national security strategy and later the Biden-Harris NSS identified the Indo-Pacific as the central stage, where two visions of world order, one free and open, one dominated by repressive regimes, are competing. The new Trump strategy takes that logic and pushes it further. It treats competition with China as a long, structural contest, not a temporary trade spat. It links control of advanced technologies, sea lanes and supply chains in Asia directly to US prosperity at home. It explicitly states that US economic success depends on winning that competition in the Indo-Pacific. In simple terms, Washington now sees Asia not just as important, but as the place where its global economic and strategic future will be decided. Taiwan is no longer treated as a quiet diplomatic file. It's now a core test case of US credibility and regional order. The strategy highlights Taiwan's position in three ways. Military geography. Taiwan sits on the second island chain, a line of islands that separates Northeast from Southeast Asia and shapes naval access in the Western Pacific. Semiconductors. Taiwan remains one of the world's most important producers of advanced chips, vital to everything from AI to weapons systems. Symbol of the rules-based order, any attempt to seize Taiwan by force would signal that great powers can redraw borders in Asia by military action. The document promises to preserve US military advantage around the island and makes clear that Washington will discourage any attempt to change the status quo by force. It underlines this by stressing that the US does not support unilateral moves by either Beijing or Taipei to alter the existing balance in the Taiwan Strait. At the same time, it reaffirms long-standing US commitments, including arms sales and support for Taiwan's self-defense within the framework of the One China policy and the Taiwan Relations Act. Taken together, this signals Washington now sees Taiwan as a frontline deterrence problem, not just a diplomatic puzzle. The US is prepared to invest heavily in ships, aircraft and regional bases to ensure Beijing cannot be confident of a quick military victory. Preventing China from establishing dominance over the South China Sea and surrounding waters is seen as essential to keeping global trade flowing and protecting US economic interests. The strategy's language on China is blunt. It portrays Beijing as a revisionist power that used decades of engagement to get rich and powerful and is now weaponizing its economic gains. It argues that earlier US policy betting that trade and integration would liberalize China failed. Several key signals emerge. China is described as a threat, particularly in the economic and technological spheres. Beijing's use of supply chains in low and middle-income countries, especially across Asia and the global south, is framed as a strategic tool, not just trade. Chinese naval and coast guard deployments around Taiwan, Japan, and in the South China Sea are depicted as part of a broader coercive campaign. In response, the document calls for a long-term effort to reshape the US-China economic relationship. It pledges to rebalance America's economic relationship with China and reduce US vulnerabilities. This isn't just about tariffs. It includes diversifying supply chains away from overdependence on Chinese manufacturing, coordinating with partners like India, Japan, and Europe on critical minerals, infrastructure, and rules for fair trade, tightening controls on strategic technologies and investment flows. So in Asia, Washington is signaling a dual-track approach: military deterrence at sea and economic statecraft on land and in boardrooms. Another big shift is burden sharing. The strategy makes it clear that the US will not carry the weight alone. Reuters' summary of the document notes that Washington wants Asian allies to spend more on defense as part of this new posture. The document highlights several key partners: Japan and Australia, central pillars of the US alliance system, and the Quad. India, explicitly described as a critical partner in countering predatory economic practices and securing the Indo-Pacific. The Quad, US, India, Japan, Australia, reaffirmed as a grouping Washington wants to strengthen and normalize as a permanent feature of Indo-Pacific security. On India specifically, the strategy uses unusually direct language. It states, "We must continue to improve commercial and other relations with India to encourage New Delhi to contribute to Indo-Pacific security, including through continued quadrilateral cooperation with Australia, Japan, and the United States, the Quad." That line signals several things. Washington wants India more firmly embedded in the security architecture of East and Southeast Asia, not just South Asia. The US sees India as a partner in shaping rules, from maritime security to critical minerals, across a wider Indo-Pacific space. Economic ties with India are viewed as strategic, not just commercial, and linked directly to balancing China. In parallel, the strategy calls for expanded naval investment and closer coordination with countries at risk from any Chinese bid to control the South China Sea, explicitly mentioning India and Japan. Militarily, the 2025 strategy is not built from scratch. It extends the logic of the 2017 NSS, which promised to maintain robust forces in Asia and to deepen cooperation with regional allies. Back then, the official text for the Indo-Pacific pledged that the US would keep a strong posture and work with allies on missile defense and maritime security. As the 2017 document put it, the 2017 National Security Strategy promised to maintain a forward military presence capable of deterring and, if necessary, defeating any adversary in the region. The new strategy takes that baseline and adjusts it to current realities. It explicitly ties forward presence to deterring conflict over Taiwan and keeping the South China Sea open. It signals more naval assets and air power in the Western Pacific and around key choke points. It emphasizes interoperability and joint planning with allies, including missile defense cooperation with Japan and South Korea, and growing defense ties with India and Southeast Asian states. In practice, this likely means more frequent and larger exercises in the Philippine Sea, around Taiwan, and through the Malacca and Lombok Straits. expanded access arrangements with countries like the Philippines, and possibly deeper cooperation with Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore. A continued push for partners to modernize their fleets and air forces so the US isn't operating alone. The signal to Beijing is that even as Washington reduces some commitments elsewhere, it is prepared to invest heavily in hard power in Asia. Another important signal is that trade, technology and finance are no longer treated as separate tracks from security in Asia. The strategy identifies several economic vulnerabilities: over-reliance on Chinese production in global supply chains, especially in low-income countries; Beijing's growing ability to use economic leverage in Asia, Africa and Latin America as a strategic tool; the risks of a hostile power controlling key sea lanes, particularly in the South China Sea, which carries around 1/3 of global shipping. To respond, the document pushes for diversification of supply chains away from China, with India, Southeast Asia and allied democracies as preferred alternatives; joint efforts with partners to secure critical minerals and high-tech manufacturing; stronger controls on sensitive technologies, from AI to telecommunications, to limit Chinese access. All of this is linked back to Asia policy. The message is that the US now treats economic arrangements in the Indo-Pacific as part of its security posture, not as a separate globalization debate. China and Taiwan dominate the documents and commentary, but the broader region isn't ignored. The strategy continues earlier commitments to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and aims to preserve the non-proliferation regime in Northeast Asia. It underscores coordination with South Korea and Japan on missile defense and deterrence. In Southeast Asia, it talks about supporting states that want to resist coercion, whether over maritime claims or economic pressure, and about helping them improve law enforcement, defense and intelligence cooperation, particularly against terrorism and grey zone maritime activities. Where it breaks with some previous US strategies is in its relative downplaying of democracy promotion as a central goal. The emphasis is more on sovereignty, security and economic alignment than on internal political reforms. Asia, defined as the Indo-Pacific, is now Washington's main strategic theatre. China is the primary rival, and the US intends to deter it militarily while constraining it economically. Taiwan is elevated as a central test of US resolve and the rules-based order. Allies like Japan, India, Australia and others are expected to shoulder much more of the cost and risk. Forward, US. Military presence and economic statecraft are fused into a single Indo-Pacific strategy. Or put even more simply, Washington's message in this national security strategy is that if you want to understand US foreign policy for the coming years, you need to watch what it does in Asia, especially around Taiwan, the South China Sea and the Quad.